Next up is Voices of Change with your hosts, Leslie Acosta and Aissia Richardson. Voices of Change is to connect, inform, and empower people to engage in social political change. Right here on USALA Radio. World news, local politics, saving money and investing, all this and more right here on USALA Radio. Your voice, your radio.
Good morning. You are listening to Voices of Change on USALA Radio with your host Leslie Acosta and Aissia Richardson. Today we have a special guest. Actually, we have two. And we're going to be talking about an interesting conversation in regards to our criminal justice reform system, not only here in Philadelphia, but across this nation. This morning, we have Pastor Gregory Holston. Pastor Holston served as POWER's executive director. POWER is an interfaith-based justice advocacy organization. And Reverend Holston led advocacy for causes such as equitable housing for Philadelphia public schools at 15 minimum wage for workers, gun violence prevention, and police accountability. He joined the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office as the senior advisor on advocacy and policy. So welcome, Pastor Holston, and it's a pleasure for me to have you here today. And we're going to have this interesting conversation. We are in a few seconds or in a few minutes. We're going to have Wendy Connor. Aissia Richardson is also on the phone. Wendy Connor served more than 4 years at a federal institution at Alderson, West Virginia. And she has firsthand knowledge of the barriers to reentry for federal inmates returning back into society. So we're going to have her chime in, and she's also going to be part of this conversation, how we can start reforming this system from the inside out. Yes. So welcome.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. Excited about this great opportunity for you.
Yeah, and Aissia, thank you for being with us this morning. I know you have a busy schedule, but you always make time to co-host this show. So thank you for being with us this morning. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit, Pastor Holston. You have done a lot of advocacy here in the city of Philadelphia in regards to this issue, not only criminal justice reform. You have taken a lot of issues that have a huge impact when it comes to this issue of not only incarceration, this revolving door of people coming out of our prisons, the recidivism rate that we have, but you also have taken issues of raising the minimum wage in Philadelphia, which is huge. Pennsylvania is really out of compliance. We're still at $7.25 an hour, and that is a huge struggle. The other thing that you have worked very hard on is on this gun violence prevention and police accountability. Talk to us a little bit about that, and then we're going to get into how you became the senior advisor to the district attorney's office.
Well, it certainly, as you know, as you met me at one of the churches that I was pastoring here, I'm a United Methodist pastor at New Vision in Broad and Westmoreland Streets, which is as the area which is one of the highest poverty areas in the city, and one of the most areas of gun violence in the city. The corner at 12th and Lehigh is the sixth most violent corner in the country. And so just really dealing with the fact that most of the people that are involved in these incidents are black and brown people, and poverty is such at the core of all of these issues in terms of gun violence. It is really important that we come together to be able to find real solutions for gun violence in our communities, but also we need to end mass incarceration. About 50 years ago, we had about 200,000 people in prisons across the country. Today, it's 2.3 million. Almost 1,000% more than we had 50 years ago. And most of them, again, are black and brown people. In Pennsylvania, even though the population here in Pennsylvania is 13% African American, 46% of the people that are in jail, in prison, are black and brown people, are black people, excuse me. And so the reality is that mass incarceration has had a devastating effect on people of color across the city. It has increased the poverty rate. It has separated families. Has caused disruptions in our schools, in our communities, in our organizations, in our churches. It has had a devastating impact. And the quicker we can end it, the quicker we can go back down to the levels we were in the 1970s, where again we were 200,000 people instead of 2.3 million people. The quicker we could do that, the better off we would be for our communities. And much of the people that are incarcerated are there because of drug convictions. They really are dealing with addiction problems, and we need to treat addiction problems not by criminalizing people, but we need to treat them as with the health problem that they really are by giving them as much treatments as we can possibly do.
Pastor, this is, an interesting dynamic of, and you stated it clearly. This country now has 2.3 million people incarcerated in our jails and in our prisons, and that. When we look at the numbers, is really affecting black and brown people.
Yes.
But politicians have to be part of this conversation. And I think your advocacy and your hard stance has been, let's get these politicians at the table, because that's really where the power lies in. How do we effectuate change if politicians are not at the table and really helping to address this issue that we have not only here in Philadelphia, across this nation?
Well, I think first it's as an organizer, as a faith leader, I would say it's organize, and organize some more. It means people coming together to vote in or to vote out people who deal with their interests, and then holding them accountable as they are in office, not getting disengaged, not saying, okay, we already voted, that's enough, but being involved in all of the issues that person deals with, coming up with an agenda for the community and making sure that individual speaks to the agenda and to control the narrative. One of the great things we were able to do is that when I remember in 2014, people were talking about Philly being the next great city. And we said, how can you be the next great city when a quarter of your population is in poverty? And he said, we started saying, no, instead we are the poorest big city in the country. And we have to address that before we can be great. And now they hear politicians some 4 or 5 years later using the same frame that we talked about 4 or 5 years ago. That gives us hope that we can direct politicians into the kinds of policy decisions that can really change things. All right? I'm excited about the City Council's poverty plan, because it's picking up some of the stuff we talked about 4 or 5 years ago, around a guaranteed income for individuals, around from raising the minimum wage, those kinds of things that are so important to our communities. And so it's really organize, and organize some more, control the narrative, push your politicians, hold them accountable, and you can see results.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree that if you organize correctly and you push these politicians, they have to listen. And I think you've done an excellent job, or Power, if you will, has done an excellent job around that advocacy and pushing politicians on the forefront to say, hey, listen, you have to listen to us. You have the power to create some solutions here. And if you're not, we're going to hold you accountable for that. And I think you've been very good at doing that and controlling the narrative.
And it's important to say, certainly Power has so much of a say in a lot of this, but there are so many movement organizations in this city that have managed, and not always easy, to work together to create the narrative to push the politicians. It is everybody that has to work together, whether it's our community groups, our churches, our faith groups, our synagogues, our mosques. All of us have to work together and talk with each other to push and hold our politicians accountable.
Absolutely. Here's the interesting thing about Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a first-class city, Pastor. How is it possible that we have all this development coming in? We have all this gentrification pushing into our neighborhoods. Our anchor institutions here in some of our communities are being uprooted because of this gentrification. And yet, all this money coming in, being a first-class city, we still have high gun violence. We still have all of these pressing issues, people, living on a minimum income. You have about 27% of the population living below or earning $26,000 or less in income. How is that possible? Having a city which is a first-class city, and you have all this development going on here.
It is perplexing, but the reality is that most of our politicians care more about what the developers think and the resources the developers have and kowtowing to developers instead of doing some really important kinds of work that could help build wealth for those 26% of the people of this city. Simple things, and one of them is being proposed right now by Kendra Brooks. I was so excited. I supported her candidacy as she became council person. And the first move she's making is rent control.
That's important.
Absolutely.
That is so important.
Anybody who's tried to find a place to rent in this city, even in our communities, are finding that some of the costs are $1,500 to $2,000 just to rent a place.
Yeah.
And so which is the biggest source of taking income away from our community is rent.
Yeah.
And so to be able to come up with rent control, to be able to say, no, in this part of this community, this area, you will not have exorbitant rents and push people out is so important. And so I'm excited that she's pushing that legislation. We need to get behind that kind of thing when people start to do the right thing.
Yeah, we would like to bring Kendra Brooks to talk about that because I think that's an important piece of legislation that she's introducing. And she knows a lot about that. She's very well versed on that issue. And I think part of her win had to do with pushing that issue. That was part of her her platform.
I was the chairperson of the Working Families Party, which actually endorsed her and pushed her, and I was there for 4 years as a chairperson or board member of Working Families Party, and I would just one of the greatest joys was to see her victory last fall.
Yeah, that was an interesting win for the working family.
Yes,
that's an important
working people.
It's interesting, Pat. You are a pastor, you're a reverend, you pastor a church. Normally there's this issue where people of interfaith, they don't get involved with politics, and I think that's a mistake. Yeah. I think pastors and I think interfaith communities, they have to get involved in politics because that's the anchor of our communities, is our interfaith organizations.
And the reality is that in my Christian faith, the center person is Jesus. But Jesus often spent many times talking to politicians. He talked to the governor. He talked to the judges. He talked to the leaders in the Roman court. He spent most of his time to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which were the political and social leaders of his time, challenging them and confronting them, and saying some very rough things to them. So I believe it's a part of the prophetic tradition of a pastor. Out of the prophets of old, of David and Obadiah, and Nahum, and all of the Old Testament prophets that challenge Isaiah, that challenge the political leaders of their time. We are supposed to be doing the same thing. So I don't know what Bible they're reading, but the Bible I'm reading says this is supposed to be the role we play.
Amen to that. Mm-hmm. Amen. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. We are listening to Voices of Change on USALA Radio with your hosts, Aissia Richardson and Leslie Acosta. We'll be right back. We're talking to Reverend Holston, Gregory Holston.
Don't wait. Communicate. Make your emergency plan today.
Thank you and welcome back. You're listening to Voices of Change on USALA Radio with your hosts, Aissia Richardson and Leslie Acosta. We have a special guest. Actually, we have two. We have Wendy Connor, who will be with us in just a minute, and we have Pastor Reverend Gregory Holston. Pastor, we've been talking a little bit about this issue of criminal justice reform, your advocacy work around these issues, and recently, you have a new role. You had to step down from power. You're now the senior advisor at the DA's office. So you advise the DA's employees on ways to integrate social justice best practices and community-based police procedures or policy procedures into their work. Externally, you work to advance the mission of the office to make the criminal justice system in Philadelphia more accessible and accountable in order to build public trust in law enforcement, the DA's office, and the court system. Aissia Richardson, after we went on a break, she had an interesting question in regards to your role and what things that are being done within the district attorney's office, changing the narrative and changing these relationships that oftentimes have been toxic between the DA's office and the community. Let's give us your spiel on how things are changing internally for the betterment of this community.
Yes, thank you. The reality is that this particular district attorney is really causing a revolution in criminal justice reform. I've said to folk as clear as I can, if you were in Montgomery in 1955 and the bus boycott happened, you would know that was an international issue that was happening. If you were in Birmingham in 63 and water hoses were being turned on the kids, you wouldn't have known that would be something we'd be talking 50 years later. And even Ferguson in 2014, small little town outside of St. Louis, people didn't know that was going to be a moment, a flashpoint in terms of Black Lives Matter. We have right here in Philadelphia, we are the center of criminal justice reform. That's not me just saying that. That's people all over the country are saying that we are the office that is transforming what criminal justice reform means, and what is called a progressive prosecutor is being invented here. And if we want to have real end to mass incarceration, we have a great opportunity in this city to be the vanguard. 3 years ago, we had the highest incarceration rate of any city in the country, and probably in any city in the world. And we have taken progressive change to try to begin to change that picture. And so I'm really proud to have joined this office and to join these professionals who are doing incredible things around ending mass incarceration to really build transformational change here in the city.
Yeah. Aissia, you had a question for Pastor Holston.
I did. So the Conviction Review Unit has been incredible in looking at the efficacy of convictions under for the district attorney's office from former DAs, and so that Conviction Review Unit is reviewing the higher felonies, right? The murder cases, and so I have a question about whether or not the Conviction Review Unit is going to start looking at small misdemeanors, like things that folks have on their records that they feel they were railroaded or they were over prosecuted. And so my question is about the Conviction Review Unit and whether or not the Conviction Review Unit is going to begin to look at the misdemeanor cases as well. Oh,
okay. Thank you. I will tell you the Conviction Integrity Unit, which my office actually sits in, are incredible individuals who are really professional at what they do. So far, with the 13th person, just this week, number 13, has already been petitioned to be released from jail. All of these individuals have been anywhere from 25 to 40 years in jail. And many, like this one, has been on death row that entire time. And really, the investigation and the honesty of investigating the office of the district attorney, the past practices in the 1990s, and also police misconduct that have driven these convictions. It has been a powerful testimony, really truth and reconciliation happening as these testimonies come forward. They are reviewing over 250 cases, and they're all murder cases. And so the question you have is really a question of people power. To take the time to review all of these cases, just the murder ones, for this unit, which is about 5 to 7 attorneys in it, is simply not enough attorneys to do all the work that probably needs to go on. And so that's a budgetary question, and that may be something that should be raised actually as the city puts its budget together about providing more resources so that more convictions can be reviewed. I would also tell you there's 2 other ways that people who have been overcharged over the years are getting out early. One is an early probation review. We are looking at people who've been on probation some 10, 15 years, much like the Meek Mill case, and we are asking those probations to be shortened, particularly for people who have done stellar while they've been on probation. Not a problem at all, not an issue at all. The question that comes after 3 or 4 or 5 years of excellence, why are you still on probation? And so we are going in courts by the hundreds and asking for those probations to be reduced, and they're being freed because of it, and also we are doing hundreds of every year of expungements are happening, where people who are out or on probation are getting their records expunged so that people can be able to freely apply for a job without having their past criminal records come up. And so we've done not hundreds, but thousands of those since Larry Krasner has been in. And we are changing the lives of people because of that. So to answer your question, we're trying to do it both ways, but we also need more resources.
Now, this issue of expungement of your criminal record, Pastor, really this lies. Harrisburg has to pass legislation to help facilitate that process. And right now, I know that Jordan Harris has been paramount in passing legislation that deals with misdemeanors. But what about with felony cases where you there's a felony? That's going to be a harder challenge, because then you have district attorneys' offices up in the center of Pennsylvania who do not agree in giving people a second chance and expunging records if you have a felony. How do we deal with that process on the policy front?
Well,
because that's a challenge.
It is a challenge. So there is a certain degree of discretion that the district attorney has in being able to ask for expungements or, again, early probation review. That just comes with the power of the office.
Right.
And so Larry Krasner has exercised that discretion time and time again on the side of lessening probation and expunging records. And so if he has the leeway to do that in terms of felony cases, we've been doing it. And he has the obviously the leeway in other cases. We've been doing it. And so we're going to continue to try to stretch his discretion as much as we can. But yes, in the long run, all of these policies that Larry Krasner is doing, there's going to need to be legislation on if it's going to last beyond Larry Krasner.
Yeah.
And last beyond this office.
And I'll give you a perfect example. Recently, in August or in July, legislation was passed by Martina White, signed by Governor Wolf, accepted by Shapiro, to limit the power of Larry Krasner here in the city of Philadelphia when it comes in, and you're pretty much familiar with that.
Yes, very
And you
much.
had 80 some Democrats vote for that legislation, and then say we didn't know we voted for that type of legislation. I mean, how do you get around that, Pastor?
So either you were sneaky or you were inept. Either you don't know how to do your job, or you sneaking around on your job. So either one is not too good. And I just would say the motivation for that is that this ending mass incarceration shrinks the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And so police who some have managed to build whole entire new houses down at the shore just on the overtime that they receive for hanging around the court waiting for a case.
Right.
If I have less cases, I get less overtime.
Right.
So I'm not happy about less overtime. If courts are not have less cases, then I need less courts. And the courts now have shrunk from 22 to 14, and juvenile courts from 7 to 3, because there are less cases. And so the court's not necessarily happy about that, for less places to put their judges.
Right.
The correction officers who have to watch the people in prison, well, they're not happy necessarily either, because I got less people to watch, which means eventually I'm going to have less jobs at the jail and at the prison.
Yeah.
And so also those folk who are statewide prisons, way out in places like Dallas and Camp Hill and other places, whole communities that depend upon that prison population.
That's it.
They're not angry, and their state senators aren't angry, and their state legislators are angry because they don't have enough, as they say, enough of their bodies. And they use that language.
Wow.
Bodies. Talking about black and brown people, Philadelphia, Larry is holding back us from getting our bodies.
Yeah. He's been under a lot of fire.
Yes.
You have the FOP who's totally against Larry. Look, Larry Krasner, I've said this over and over again on this program, that he never lied about his progressive views.
Yes.
And he was upfront about that. And when he ran on the platform of transforming the DA's office, and he has done exactly that, and he has not lied about that. And so he has a whole swath of people against him because of his progressive views.
Yeah, if he did not tell the truth about that and did not do what he said he would do, I wouldn't be here at this office with him. Because he's probably one of the few politicians I can remember actually ran on what he said he was going to do and has actually implemented it right away.
Exactly.
I can stand with him and say that we need to get behind the criminal justice reform that's happening in the city.
Well, that's a great point. You're listening to Voices of Change on USALA Radio with your hosts, Leslie Acosta and Aissia Richardson. We'll be right back. We're going to take a short break.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies. Selfie, nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Greg, come on man, let's split a ride home.
If you love them enough to suck the snot out of their nose at 4 a.m., then surely you'll check nhtsa.gov/the right seat to make sure they're in the right car seat.
Welcome back. You are listening to Voices of Change on Usula Radio with your hosts, Leslie Acosta and Aissia Richardson. We have a special guest here today, Reverend Gregory Holston. He was the former executive director of Power and now is a senior advisor for the district attorney's office. And I'm glad that we have a voice at the district, sitting at the table at the district attorney's office. So, Pastor, we've been talking a little bit about these issues of criminal justice reform, the intricacies of it, the complexity of it in terms of moving some policies forward, helping people get out of the situation of poverty. Poverty and crime all goes in together. You can't take one away from the other. When you talk about crime, let's talk about poverty. Let's talk about this issue of a lot of people don't know this, Pastor, and a lot of people are not having conversations about this $1 million block project. You are very familiar with this subject. You know a lot about this issue of incarceration, how it creates these $1 million blocks. Tell us a little bit about that, and how is that so? Talk to us about the $1 million block project.
Well, I guess I first heard about this in a report that was done maybe about 4 years ago around the block. I believe it was 27th and Taylor in North Philadelphia, and that when you added all of the costs to incarcerate the individuals that lived on that block, that all of those costs per year would be over $1 million. And so thus the idea of the $1 million block. I would probably suggest that figure is probably more than doubled now.
Yeah.
The cost of a prisoner being housed in Pennsylvania, last figure I had received was about $61,000 a year to house a prisoner in the state of Pennsylvania. And so, the cost of really just beginning to measure the cost of what it costs to incarcerate people and how many dollars, it has really been a method to bring on and accentuate to more conservative Republicans who don't care about the issue of justice, but care the issue about fiscal responsibility. To say, is it fiscally responsible to spend $61,000 on an individual to house them in prison, to spend a block for over a million, probably millions of dollars now, on one block to incarcerate people, when you could take about $25,000 and invest it in those people each year and be able to move them out of crime into an economic place where they could be able to provide for themselves and also stop the violence that goes on in the community. It is really saying to those Republicans, it does not make fiscal sense to do this any longer. There are other ways. There are diversion programs. There are many other programs that cost a lot less and provide much more opportunity to change and transform the community if we would just move in that direction. And so the whole $1 million block project was the idea that if we keep pushing on this issue and we use the $1 million not for incarceration, but for community programs and for the kinds of things that build community, we can build a better city for ourselves.
Yeah. The question is, how could we improve the health of these neighborhoods if we invest these $1 million into community development, into jobs or education instead of incarceration? I think that's the idea behind the project.
Yes, absolutely.
Pastor and Aissia and Wendy, we have 2.3 million people incarcerated in our jails today. That's a huge amount of people. At the federal level, you have about 200,000, and the remaining amount you have them at the state level. And a disproportionate of this incarceration comes from a handful of neighborhoods that are poor, where crime is high. There's a concentration of incarceration rates is so dense that some of these states are spending in excessive of so much money to lock up these people that we don't need to be locked up. The other issue that I have with this, and that's the piece where Wendy's going to come in, is the halfway houses. Pastor, for each person that enters a halfway house once post-incarceration, they pay that halfway house per person $4,500. And these halfway houses are not doing an excellent job in providing resources and integrating people back into society. It's a revolving door. It's a political issue. It has nothing to do with enhancing and helping the well-being of people coming back into our society. What say you about this and how we can start addressing this issue on that front? And after you do your spiel, I'm going to bring Wendy Connor, who has personal experience, lived in a halfway house for 3 months, and she can tell you from experience how this is not working.
Well, like so many of the social programs, halfway houses, they're being paid by the number of people they have. They're not being paid by the quality of the work that they do.
Right.
And so if they can just have a body in the bed, they're happy because they receive the same amount of resources, whether that body in the bed successfully completes that program or whether the body in bed fails completely and goes back to prison. And so we need to build in accountability. We need to build in, before you receive one state dollar or federal dollar or city dollar, that you have to account for your success or your failure rate in helping keep people transition to a better life. And you have to be called to account. A friend of mine reminded me that one of the things that they did in the previous mayor administration was they used to bring all of these people in and sit and put them on television and then ask the question, how do we know whether you're successful or not? Give us your numbers. And people would sit there and refuse to give their numbers. Would say, I'm not telling you this.
Yeah.
Even though they're receiving city and state and federal money, our tax dollars,
yes,
but you don't feel accountable to us. We have to bring that level of accountability back to halfway houses and every other social program that's in this city.
Yeah. Wendy, welcome. And I know that this is an issue dear to your heart. You've been doing a lot of advocacy around this. You've talked about this. We had these conversations when we were both at Alderson, West Virginia. And talk to us a little bit about your experience and this whole apparatus of the halfway houses that really is not working for average folks like you and me. Or didn't work.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and for shedding light on such a very important topic. And I'll tell you, I'm sitting here right now on fire at just listening to Pastor Holston and the amazing things that are going on in Philadelphia. I'm in North Carolina, and unfortunately, we don't have that kind of support here yet. There's a lot of work to be done. And as it relates to the halfway house, I spent a little bit over 5 months in a halfway house. I was able to see the processes from start to finish. And the thing that is missing, and Pastor Holston hit it, is there is no performance-based system and there is no accountability. I mean, the halfway house that I resided in strictly was there as a profit center. There was no education and training. There were little resources. It was more of, I would say, a glorified, babysitting service, if I'm being very honest. If we just talk about the issue of employment alone, let's talk about that for a minute, because for me, it was really two issues. One issue is employment, and the other issue is your ability to really connect with the community and your family. Finding sustainable employment is virtually impossible when you're in a halfway house. I mean, the rules and requirements alone are going to impede your ability to even gain employment. First of all, smart devices nor computers are allowed in halfway houses. We all know we live in a digital age now, and so most employers are going to require you to go through an electronic or digital process in order to even complete an application. Many of your interviews now are held via a teleconference. And so when you live in a halfway house, you don't have the ability to do that. Then there is the limitation in terms of even the time that you get to spend out to seek employment. That's typically going to be anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day. That also includes your travel time. In most cases, you have to use the public transit system in order to even look for employment. And so you're then confined to maybe having 2 hours of time, 2 to 3 hours of actually being able to beat the pavement to find a job. But let's say you find a job. Do you know that when you find a job, you are required to pay the halfway house 25%
of your pay,
of your gross income, And so let's put that in perspective. The average American pays 24% in taxes on their income. So you've been taxed at 24% on average. You're paying 25% of the pre-tax amount to the halfway house.
Wow.
You're realizing less than half of your wages. And in many cases, the wages that we earn when we return to society are far less than those people that have the same skill sets, our counterparts, because people who are employing and taking a chance on individuals returning from prison don't tend to pay you what you're really worth. And so if I have to pay 25% of my income to the halfway house, how do I save for a car? Yes. How do I gain a place to stay? How do I reconnect with my kids and my family? How do I even get the necessary things that I need? My hygiene, how do I get that? And so we have got work to do when it comes to figuring out a way to change the system and make it accountable. So most individuals at halfway houses end up taking a day laborer job. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. It's an honest wage. But those jobs typically are not sustainable. The moment you leave the halfway house, you no longer have the transportation that you had because many of those agencies actually pick you up, take you to work for the day, pay you at the end of the day, and you come in and you pay the halfway house, and then you leave the next day.
Yeah.
If you don't pay the halfway house, you can't leave the halfway house. So if you refuse to pay that 25%, you are what they consider you're on lockdown. You have no movement whatsoever. And now what happens? You've lost a job. And so I believe that if, we talk about solutions, we're just talking about the employment, and there are so many things that need to be addressed. But if we're talking about reentry as it relates to employment, what we really need to do is we really need to hold these halfway houses accountable. Employment agencies are not allowed to come on board. There's no resume writing services available for individuals who don't have a resume. There is no training or education on how to use the new technology that we have. Pastor Holston spoke earlier about an individual who's been away for over 20 years. Do you know how much technology has changed in 20 years?
Yeah.
I was at the halfway house with people who didn't even know how to use a smartphone. And so we have got to figure out a way at a federal level how we can make some substantial changes when it comes to those transition services and transition plans. And in my opinion, the payment of those facilities need to be based on performance and accountability.
Yeah, and this is an issue, Pastor, not only at the federal but also at the state level. And you hit the nail on the head. If you're getting resources from the state and the federal government, you have to be held accountable. And if things are not working internally and these resources are not being provided adequately, something has to give here, because then this becomes a revolving door of people. If you fail at the halfway house, you're going to fail in the community. You're going to go right back into prison. That's why our recidivism rate is so high, not only in Philadelphia, across this country, because we're not holding, first of all, our halfway houses accountable, and secondly, we're not providing a sustainability plan for these people who come out of post-incarceration. So this is a revolving door, Pastor.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for Wendy for sharing so much of that information. I was not even aware of the 25% that had to be paid back to the halfway house. That is basically something out of Charles Dickens and a debtor's prison.
Absolutely.
You got to pay or you going to stay. I mean that
absolutely.
That's crazy for helping somebody supposed to be moving them into a better life, while really you're locking them into the life that they've been trying to get out of. And so I thank you, and I hope that you continue to do your advocacy work down there and make it better for the folk down there. But we need to call out accountability, performance evaluation, and recognition that many people that are getting these dollars is because they supported politicians on the other side in their campaigns or whatever, and that they feel because of that support that they don't need to be held accountable, and that the politicians won't hold them accountable.
Yeah.
And so it's really important for the community to speak up and to be clear about what's happening with your own family members who may be caught up into this process. And we need a much more education to be able to understand it so that we can provide the supportive services we need.
Yeah, and you know, Wendy, in order for this to be success, or anyone that enters a halfway house to be successful, you and I know to be effective in the process of reintegration, part of that we need to focus on 3 critical issues. And one of that is the employment part of it, the education part of it, and then the support, because all those 3 things, they go hand in hand. In order for you to be successful and to reintegrate back into society. You know, we have to, and at the end of the day, employment is what makes people whole. You know, residents, once they're back into society, they have employment, they repay their debts to society, they become responsible, independent citizens, they're taxpayers. You know, they're back, they become productive members of society. And I thank you for that perspective, Wendy, and we have to do more work around that area.
Absolutely. You're welcome. You know, anytime. I think anytime you can gain perspective from someone who's been on the inside, it makes you aware of new things. Like Pastor Holston just said, he had no idea at a federal level you pay 25% of your gross. And it allows those individuals to engage in a way where you can fully understand what their struggles or what the barriers to transition and reintegration really are. So I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, part of this, politics has also played a damaging role in the halfway house industry, you know, because of these contracts. These are huge contracts.
Yes.
And are sometimes influenced by political contributors that give, and lobbyists who give a lot of money to these politicians. And so the outcomes or performance measures, they, you know, are poor. And so government officials appears to be more interested in reducing expenses by placing offenders in halfway houses rather than investing the resources necessary to ensure stable post-release housing and employment. And that's a big issue.
Absolutely. I mean, there are industries, there are corporations in this industry that are making billions of dollars a year. Just housing people in prison, housing people in halfway houses, providing the services. They are getting wealthy. They are becoming large business enterprises. And that's why we have to call it what it is. It is the prison industrial complex. It is a complex of corporations and businesses that profit off of the misery of mainly black and brown people. And so that has always been the case in this country, from slavery to Jim Crow, now mass incarceration, people making profit off of black and brown misery. And so for our country to really be the country of its promise, that we the people, if we're really going to be that, then we have to stop and take the profit out of the misery of black and brown people. We have to end mass incarceration, and we have to find other systems and other ways of adjudicating justice in our country.
Yeah, absolutely. Pastor, I want to end this segment or this episode of Voices of Change with a quote that you made to WHYY, and it was a very powerful quote that you stated, and I wanted to reiterate that here today before we end this program. You quoted, and I'm quoting you now, "Our mission is to both acknowledge and address racial and economic injustice in Philadelphia, to ensure all Philadelphians have a reasonable expectation of safety regardless of income or zip code, and to transform our criminal justice system into an entity that supports all people, regardless of their social status, skin color, nation of origin, or who they love." And that's a powerful statement. And I want you to, we will end this program with that quote and with your last word, Pastor.
Well, I thank you. And it sounded even better when you said it. But that's what we have to be about. That's the kind of change we need to be. That's the 21st century criminal justice reform we need to be about. And when we are about it, we can build the kind of community, the beloved community that we so richly deserve and so richly have desired from, stated from Martin Luther King many, many years ago. We can have that. We can have that now. We have the resources. We have the wealth. We just need to redistribute it in a way that everyone can be lifted up and everyone can have a wonderful life. And so that's my goal and that's my mission. And I'm thankful to be here today.
Well, thank you, Reverend Holston, for being here today. Thank you, Wendy Connor, for your contribution here at on Usala Radio.
You.
And Aissia, thank you for being with us today. Anything else, Aissia, before we end?
No, it's great to hear from Reverend Holston, and just congratulations on his new appointment in the District Attorney's Office. Looking forward to working with you on some projects.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. We have concluded the segment of the show. You're listening to Voices of Change on Usala Radio with your host, Leslie Acosta and Aissia Richardson. We'll see you here next Saturday. Thank you.